The kernels are the wrong color, and everyone at the grain buyer's counter knows it before Renata Suárez even finishes setting the crate
This is
down.
pure native.
Deep violet black, almost iridescent under the fluorescent lights of the co-op's receiving station. Nothing like the pale gold corn stacked in bins behind the counter. The buyer picks up one ear, turns it over once, and sets it back down. I don't have anywhere to put this, he tells her. Nobody's asking for purple corn. Renata already knew he'd say that. She'd heard some version of it from 3 other buyers that same week. 8 months later, a chef from 400 miles away will call her directly, asking whether this season's harvest is spoken for yet. The 3rd such call that week. Nobody in that receiving station could have explained why. What did those chefs eventually see in a crop that every local buyer had already decided wasn't worth the shelf space? If you believe the best farming stories are about seeing value before anyone else does, subscribe to this channel. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Renata Suárez was 39 that spring, 3 years into running her own 22-acre vegetable and row crop operation outside Ferris County, in the rolling hill country of central Kentucky. She'd spent the previous decade working as a produce buyer for a regional grocery distributor, a job that had taught her, more than anything else, how markets actually decided what was worth stocking and what wasn't. She'd planted a test plot of purple corn, a heritage variety called Jimaca Purple, prized in parts of Mexico and the American Southwest for uses that had nothing to do with how most Kentucky buyers thought about corn at all. Almost on a whim the previous fall, after reading about its unusually high anthocyanin content in an agricultural extension bulletin. The risk wasn't abstract. Ferris County's local buyers, the grain co-op, the 2 produce distributors serving the regional grocery chains, even the farmers market's produce coordinator, all worked within a system built around what customers already recognized and expected. Purple corn didn't fit anywhere in that system. It wasn't a sweet corn variety anyone could eat straight off the cob the way they would yellow or white sweet corn. It wasn't a field corn variety anyone processed for feed or ethanol at meaningful scale. It occupied an unfamiliar middle space that made buyers nervous rather than curious. Renata had planted only 3/4 of an acre that first season, a deliberate limited test rather than a bet on the whole farm. The receiving station rejection wasn't the only one. Renata brought samples to both regional produce distributors that August. Both gave her some version of the same practical hesitation. Who's your customer for this? One distributor asked her directly. I can't put something on a shelf if I can't tell you who's going to buy it. It was a fair question. Renata didn't have a confident answer yet. So why did she keep growing it, after 3 consecutive rejections in a single month? Part of the answer was practical. She'd already sunk the seed cost and the labor into that 3/4 acre plot. Walking away from it wouldn't recover anything. But the deeper reason was something she'd noticed during her years as a buyer, watching which unusual products eventually found real markets and which ones quietly disappeared from shelves within a season. The products that survived weren't simply novel. They solved a specific problem for a specific customer, usually someone who cared about something commodity buyers didn't. Flavor, color, texture, a particular culinary use that ordinary versions of the product couldn't deliver. Renata didn't yet know who that customer was for her corn, but she suspected the local grain buyer and the grocery distributors weren't it. What Renata discovered that fall, working through the harvested ears in her kitchen, was that the purple corn behaved differently depending on how it was processed, a detail that mattered enormously to a chef but meant almost nothing to a conventional grain buyer. Ground into flour or masa, the corn produced a strikingly deep blue-violet color that held up through cooking, useful for tortillas, tamales, and a specific style of blue corn atole that some Southwestern and Mexican kitchens specifically sought out. Dried whole and used to make a light corn stock, or infused into simple syrup, the kernels released a subtle, slightly sweet, almost floral flavor note that was distinct from ordinary field corn. None of this mattered to a grain elevator buyer measuring bushels for feed. All of it mattered, potentially, to a chef. That winter, Renata ran a small, deliberate experiment rather than expanding the crop blindly. She processed a portion of her harvest into masa and corn flour herself, working through recipes at her kitchen table, documenting which preparation methods preserved the color best and which flavor notes came through most clearly. She recorded everything: moisture content at harvest, grinding method, color retention after cooking, the same methodical habits she'd once used to evaluate produce quality as a buyer. The first real obstacle came not from the corn itself, but from timing. Renata had harvested the crop slightly too early that first season, eager to get product to potential buyers before the growing interest she'd hoped for might fade. The kernels, harvested before reaching full physiological maturity, produced flour with noticeably less vivid color and a starchier, less developed flavor than the test batches she'd processed from fully mature ears the previous fall. The corn's not the problem, her agricultural extension contact told her when she brought in samples that spring, comparing the two batches under better light. Your harvest timing changed what you actually had to sell. It was a frustrating, costly lesson. A third of that season's usable harvest went into the compost pile rather than the market, the color too inconsistent to represent the product she actually wanted to sell. For a brief stretch that spring, Renata genuinely questioned whether the purple corn had been worth the acreage at all. She had, by her own accounting, spent nearly $4,000 across seed, labor, and processing equipment for a harvest she still hadn't sold a meaningful portion of. The question that reshaped Renata's approach that spring wasn't about the corn anymore. It was about who she'd been trying to sell it to. She'd been treating the purple corn like a commodity crop, trying to move volume through the same conventional buyers who purchased her ordinary vegetables, when its actual value depended on an entirely different kind of market. That distinction mattered because specialty markets carried real trade-offs. A conventional grocery distributor could move thousands of pounds of product through established channels with minimal marketing effort. A specialty buyer, a chef, a small culinary distributor, might only need a few hundred pounds a season, but would pay significantly more per pound for exactly the right product, delivered reliably, at exactly the right specifications. Renata began researching, that spring, which regional restaurants specialized in Southwestern, Mexican, or Latin American cuisine, kitchens where blue and purple corn products weren't a novelty, but an established, sought-after ingredient. She found her first real opening at a modest restaurant 40 minutes from her farm, a small, well-regarded spot called Cielo Azul, run by a chef named Marcus Reyes who'd grown up in New Mexico before relocating to Kentucky and had spent years, without much local success, trying to source authentic blue corn masa for a handful of dishes on his menu. Renata brought him a sample that summer, properly harvested this time, full color, carefully documented processing notes included. Marcus was skeptical at first, the way any chef sourcing an unfamiliar ingredient from an unfamiliar farm reasonably would be. He tested it in a small batch of tortillas that same afternoon, comparing the color and texture against the commercially sourced blue corn masa he'd been importing at considerable expense from a distributor 2 states away. "This is close," he told her, tasting one. "Actually, this might be better than what I've been getting." He placed a modest first order, 60 pounds of processed corn flour, enough for a few weeks of menu use. It wasn't enough, on its own, to justify the acreage Renata had planted. But it was the first genuine external validation that the product had real value to the right customer. Could one restaurant's order actually become enough demand to make the crop worthwhile long-term? Not yet, not close. Marcus called again 3 weeks later, and this second conversation revealed a problem Renata hadn't fully anticipated. He liked the product, but he needed consistency, the same color intensity, the same grind texture, delivered on a predictable schedule he could plan his menu around, not whatever batch happened to come out of Renata's kitchen mill that week. "I can't put something on the menu I might not be able to get again in 3 weeks, he told her, not unkindly, but directly. Growing good corn, Renata realized, wasn't actually the hardest part of this. Building a reliable product, consistent quality, dependable timing, proper packaging that preserved color and freshness during transport, was its own separate challenge entirely. She spent that fall building actual systems around the crop, rather than treating each harvest as a one-off event. A consistent harvest timing protocol tied to kernel moisture testing, a standardized grinding process, proper airtight packaging to preserve color, and a simple record-keeping system that let her track which sections of her field produced the most consistent color from season to season. The realization that reshaped everything wasn't that purple corn was valuable because it was different. It was that its value only existed for the customer who specifically needed what it offered, and that finding that customer, reliably, meant building relationships rather than simply hoping the right buyer eventually noticed her. By the following spring, with her production process finally consistent, Marcus placed regular seasonal orders. He also, without much prompting from Renata, mentioned her corn to another chef he knew, a woman named Priya Anand, running a small farm-to-table restaurant 2 counties over, who'd been separately searching for a reliable local source of specialty corn products for a seasonal tamale dish. Priya's order led, that same year, to a mention in a regional culinary newsletter that covered farm-to-table sourcing across the broader bluegrass region, a modest publication, but one read closely by chefs actively looking for exactly this kind of ingredient. By her 3rd season growing the crop, Renata had expanded to just under 3 acres, still a fraction of her total operation, but enough to support 5 regular restaurant accounts across 2 states. The out-of-region calls started that same year, and the pathway, once Renata traced it back, made sense rather than feeling like unexplained luck. A chef in Nashville, who'd worked briefly alongside Marcus Reyes early in his career, asked him where he sourced his blue corn masa. Marcus gave him Renata's number. That chef mentioned it, in turn, at a regional culinary conference to another chef from Chicago, specifically hunting for an authentic, small farm source of specialty corn for a new menu concept. By her 4th season, Renata was fielding calls from restaurants in 4 states, none of whom she'd ever contacted directly herself. Her neighbor, a longtime row crop farmer named Walt Bregman, who'd watched her plant that first 3/4-acre plot with open skepticism 3 years earlier, stopped by that fall while she was loading crates for a delivery run. Didn't figure that corn would ever amount to much, he told her, watching her stack the carefully packaged crates. How'd you find a market for something like that, clear out in Chicago? Renata gave him the honest answer, rather than a triumphant one. I stopped trying to sell it to everybody, she said. I found the few people who actually needed it. By the end of that 4th season, Renata sat down to calculate what the purple corn had actually earned, beyond the growing list of restaurants now requesting it. Gross revenue from the crop that season came to just over $26,000. A meaningful sum, but not, on its own, the full picture. After expenses, Renata's net profit from the purple corn that season came to roughly $14,000, on less than 3 acres, a per-acre return significantly higher than her conventional row crops produced on comparable ground, though it had required far more labor and attention per acre to achieve. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't the kind of number that changed her life overnight. But it was real, sustainable, and, critically, repeatable, season after season, as long as she kept the quality and consistency that had made it valuable in the first place. What Renata Suárez learned, growing a crop that every local buyer had initially rejected, wasn't that being different was automatically valuable. It was that value only exists where it meets a genuine need, and that finding the customer who actually needs what you're offering sometimes matters more than perfecting the product itself. The purple corn was never going to work as a commodity. Local grain buyers were right about that, in their own context. What they'd missed, what Renata had eventually learned to see instead, was that her crop simply belonged to a different market entirely, one that didn't yet exist for her until she went looking for it, one relationship at a time. A farmer doesn't always need to grow what everyone else is growing, or sell it the way everyone else sells theirs. Sometimes the opportunity isn't in the field at all. It's in understanding exactly who's been waiting for what you already have. This is the Rural Files. Every farm has a story. And sometimes, the crop nobody wanted was simply waiting for someone patient enough to find who actually did.